All right, welcome back, Focus Learners, to today's Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the fascinating and honestly, sometimes frustrating legal mechanics of how judges are actually required to read and apply the law. You know, we often picture judges as these ultimate arbiters of fairness, just magically making everything right. But as we look at the source notes today, we're going to see their primary job is actually way more rigid than that. We are mastering the absolute foundational requirement for all judges, the plain meaning rule. To figure this out, we're going to navigate a legal decision matrix together. Here's a quick look at our agenda. 1. Interpretation versus construction. 2. Defining the literal rule. 3. The price of strict adherence. 4. Hitting the absurdity threshold. And finally, number 5, discovering the soul of the law. Okay, let's lay the groundwork. Section 1. Interpretation versus construction. This comparison right here beautifully illustrates our baseline. Think of interpretation as a really strict science. The focus is entirely on the literal meaning of the word to find its true objective sense. A judge uses this when the text is plain and clear. Boom, end of story. But contrast that with construction. Now this is an art form. The focus shifts to the spirit and the broader meaning of the law, where a judge draws conclusions beyond just the direct text. But, and this is a massive but, a judge only gets to use this art when the text becomes ambiguous or totally absurd to resolve an unforeseen gap.
Moving on to Section 2, let's actually define the literal rule.
So the literal rule, which is also commonly known as the plain meaning rule, basically dictates that words have to be understood in their natural, ordinary, or popular sense. Judges aren't sitting there looking for secret, hidden legal codes. They are literally asking how the average person on the street defines everyday items. For instance, our source notes cite the Washi Hamed case, which literally hinged on the everyday definitions of things like green ginger, betel, or butter. The primary rule here is super simple. The intention of the legislature is found exactly in the words they used. Nothing more, nothing less.
Which brings us to this landmark ruling from way back in 1895, Brophy versus the Attorney General of Manitoba. The court explicitly stated, "The question is not what may have been intended, but what has been said." I mean, that perfectly captures why judges are interpreters, not creators, right? They are completely bound by the exact ink on the page. This preserves the strict separation of powers, making sure a judge doesn't accidentally or purposely become a legislator.
And Lord Atkin absolutely doubled down on this idea in the 1939 case Pakala Narayanaswamy versus Emperor. He established some really firm guardrails, stating that when the meaning is plain, courts should not busy themselves with supposed intention. So the absolute crucial takeaway here is that courts should never, ever speculate on the subjective intentions of lawmakers if the language they chose to enact is already crystal clear.
But that brings us to Section 3, the price of strict adherence.
Now we have to ask a really difficult question. What if the plain text creates a harsh or entirely unjust reality? I mean, does a judge have the power to bend a clear rule if applying it literally seems totally unfair to the actual people involved?
Well, according to Lord Brotham's rule in the 1846 case of Crawford versus Spooner, the answer is a resounding no. The rule explicitly states you must take the word as the legislature has given them, period. A judge absolutely must not apply their own opinions of sound policy to modify a plain meaning. If the language is clear, it has to be enforced, even if the result is hard, unjust, or seemingly absurd, because in the eyes of the law, consistency and certainty trump an individual judge's notion of fairness.
Let's look at how this plays out in reality. The M.V. Joshi versus M.U. Shimpi case is this brilliant little mini-narrative of strict adherence in action. So the Prevention of Food Adulteration Act had a very strict statutory definition of curd as being prepared from milk and cream. A shopkeeper tried to use a clever technical workaround, arguing he prepared his specific product from curd directly, not milk. But you know what? The court did not care about his clever loophole. They strictly enforced the rigid literal boundaries of the act, ruling that his product still fell within its ambit. Strict adherence means absolutely no exceptions if the text applies.
All right, let's look at Section 4, hitting the absurdity threshold.
So while literalism is the primary tool, our source notes are super clear on this. It is not an absolute snare. There are limitations. First off, the interpretation cannot render the act totally futile. We see this in the R versus Allen bigamy case. Second, context is king. Words don't just exist in a vacuum. And third, beneficial legislation cannot be reduced to a mechanical interpretation that ends up defeating its very purpose. We can really see the danger of staying too rigid right here. Mechanical interpretation fails to adapt to modern reality, which just renders laws futile. But if you contrast that with purposive application, things change completely.
Our nodes cite the DV Act, the Domestic Violence Act. To truly protect victims, courts have had to look beyond strict, mechanical, older definitions of marriage to address actual social realities today, like live-in relationships.
And this right here is the major pivot point in our decision matrix. If the literal construction leads to a completely absurd result, what the law formally calls manifest absurdity, the court may finally depart from the literal meaning just to avoid it. The Lee versus Knapp case is cited here as the prime example. When the literal sense turns a law into a total dead letter, the court crosses the threshold from the science of interpretation into the art of construction. They basically unlock a new level of judicial power.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 5, the soul of the law.
Diving directly into the actual source notes, we find this incredibly profound observation by Justice Krishna Iyer in the Chairman, Board of Mining Examination versus Ramji case. This is exactly where the rigid mechanics of law meet its deeper human purpose.
Justice Krishna Iyer famously observed that to be purely literal is to see the skin and entirely miss the soul of the law. He introduced this amazing concept of Deha and Dehi. Deha represents the skin, the physical words of the provision, while Dehi represents the soul. He argued that the real judicial key to construction is that the literal words, the Deha, must be illuminated by the intended goal, the Dehi. The words are guided by the goal. It's that simple, but that profound.
Ultimately, it's this really delicate balancing act between maintaining the absolute certainty of the written word and ensuring the ultimate justice of the law's intent. So, the next time you see a controversial court ruling pop up in the news, I want you to remember this explainer. Visualize this decision matrix we went through today, and ask yourself a provocative question. Did the judge strictly follow the skin of the text, or were they forced to search for the soul of the law? Keep learning, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.